Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. So this week I'm going to be playing the second part of the conversation I had with Rowe on the theory that Noah's flood was a regional flood. So I'll just dive you right back into that really quickly and pick up roughly where I left us off last week.
Is God limited to an ancient Near Eastern audience? And the answer is no. He's
definitely not.
So when I debated Aaron Ra, actually, I asked Aaron Ra this question. I was like, let's have a thought experiment. So God obviously is like Dr. Brown from Back to the Future. He's already made time travel. So that's probably the most advanced thing you could ever do, right? Is make the DeLorean travel through time. Now this individual far exceeds in scientific knowledge all the Dr. Browns and other people before him, before that moment back. So if he were to go back in time, say to the 1800s, like you see in Back to the Future Part 3, now, obviously he's in his little factory making like this big machine that's just a refrigerator, just to make a little ice cube. But he has the knowledge to teach them on paper how time machine works, how time travel works. What would Dr. Brown have to do if he's meant to communicate this thing? Because back in the 1800s, they didn't have non-Euclidean maths, which you see in Einstein's field equations, and onwards into quantum mechanics and all that. And so Dr. Brown would have to either invent a type of new lingo to communicate these ideas or accommodate, for now, the limited vocabulary of the day in such a way that he doesn't alienate his audience, but at the same time, to the best of his ability, sort of makes it digestible to them. And when a future reader of his works happens to just find his work, like you see Marty, like later on finding Dr. Brown's works, that obviously they can read the same thing and go, oh, it's like as if he's talking to me today, even though it was talking to them at the time. So now let's take an analogy and apply to 5,000, 6,000 years of a vast difference of communication and language. You're talking about the ancient Near Eastern culture that is vastly different to the way we think today. And so God's dilemma, I guess, is to if he did communicate to that ancient culture first, how am I to maintain that message I told them to be applicable to a people group in the 21st century, which is you and me? And so I see Genesis 1 fine-tuned exactly like that. I can read the Tiamat Marduk chaos story in Genesis 1 verse 2 with the whole the Tehom of the dark depths that the spirit is hovering over and so on. So I can read ancient Near Eastern cosmology right in that verse. Mm-hmm. I then flip that around and go, yeah, in Earth's early history, it was a water world. It was dark on the surface, and over time, you have a transformation of the atmosphere that light finally is introduced onto the surface, obviously through a translucent way. But yeah, the first day of creation actually makes sense from a scientific point of view. So there you have both, in my opinion.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's a lot of stuff there. I was going to say, what you're saying there about the Back to the Future example reminds me of something Dallas Willard, I heard him once say, where he was talking about how Christ's message is, live in my truth, you'll become my disciples, that's how you'll get grace, etc., etc. And he said, well, he kind of had a funny way of going about this, where he said, and then you can ask questions like, well, why didn't Christ give his disciples the relativity equation? Because you think that would be useful, right?
Yeah.
Well, the obvious answer is his disciples just wouldn't have even known what to do with it, which is exactly the point you're trying to get at there with your Back to the Future example, where I've heard this from guys like Aaron Ra and other people like that, where they're like, well, if the Bible is an inspired word of God, why didn't it do things like give us the way to make vaccines or all these other various things? And it's such an obvious answer that, well, 6,000 years ago, you wouldn't have even known what to do with that because it's so far removed from even the basic knowledge. You'd have to I don't even know how you could even begin to build up to that, because they didn't have even it's not that they didn't have the conceptions. They didn't have the conceptions of the conceptions of the conceptions of the conceptions. So, because
the scientific method that, by the way, was birthed by Christianity later on in the development of the church after Constantine, was the reason why you have this application of maths to the natural world. Because don't forget, math at the time was actually more esoteric and believe it or not, pagan. It wasn't. There was no calculus. That's why Ptolemy was stuck with his geocentric model, because he didn't have the maths to understand that. Because he was noticing peculiarities in his model that he knew. Well, he didn't use it in this term like a heliocentric context, but he knew this is a bit odd. It should be the other way around, sort of thing. He just didn't have the maths to prove it. Over time, obviously, had the development of that, and
he knew there were problems in the theory, but he didn't have a better one to go with.
And just with his observations, But just quickly for your audience, look at this. He passed away in 2017, but he was a very prominent Old Testament scholar. His name is John Sailhammer. He wrote the book Genesis Unbound, where he decided his intention was, let's be the Doc Brown that goes back in time. But instead of, he didn't use his argument, but I'm sort of paraphrasing what he was trying to communicate in that book. So if we go back in time, so instead of Doc Brown educating the people back then, how about the people back then educate Doc Brown? And so how would an ancient Israelite pass or write a commentary on, or what would they have written if you asked them to write a commentary on, say, the first two verses of Genesis 1? So paraphrase the first two verses of Genesis 1, and I'll read it out. So this is John Sailhammer's paraphrase translation, what an ancient Israelite would have said. So verse 1 reads like this. Long ago, God created the world. He created the sun, the moon, and the stars, as well as all the creatures which inhabit the earth. He created all of them out of nothing, not in a single instant of time, but over a vast period of time. And that's the end of verse 1. So in our translations, we see it as, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then immediately the floodgates open where it's like, oh, Bereshit there. It's not an independent clause. It's dependent, meaning it's not in the beginning. It's sometime in the distant past. God already was formulating the bara nature, from nothing. This thing known as the heavens and the earth, which is a merism phrase in Hebrew to mean the totality of everything. So notice I've done a commentary on the Hebrew there, and that's exactly what Sailhammer's point is that long ago God created the world, the cosmos, this universe, and then in that creating, he creates the sun, the moon, and the stars, as well as all the creatures which inhabit earth. He created all of them out of nothing, not in a single instant of time, but over a vast period of time. So it's like, notice that automatically responds to the young earth creationist arguments of the sun, because the young earth creationists say the sun appears on day 4. John Sailhammer goes, just by Hebrew grammar alone, verse 1 already has the sun existing. And verse 1 is not some instant in time moment sort of thing where everything just pops into being. We're talking, it's taken a long process, and then science fills in the gaps for that, of how long that takes. But that the sun is already there before you get into verse 2 and onwards. And this is what I told R&R. I find the text to be remarkably accurate here, accurate but wise here, with respect to the time span of this, because R&R mentioned, if you're talking about accuracy in these ancient texts, it seems that the Hindu Vedas and the Mahabharata, and like they speak about the Earth being 4.5 billion years old or something like that. And then I told Aaron, I was like, yeah, it is interesting that it has that context, which, by the way, there's reasons why it has that because of the calendar math in Hinduism. But a billion years from now, that same text, if read aloud, would be an error because the universe is not static, it's dynamic, it's changing over time. Time moves forward. So that text would be outdated a billion years from now. Isn't it interesting that Genesis, it has the sequence of the natural order of historic events in regards to Earth's cycle, but it doesn't give like a timestamp. Okay, at this particular date, so many 1,000 years ago, this is when it happened, because then it would be outdated. It just gives you the epochs without having to put a timestamp on it. And I find that very wise.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
This morning juxtaposition is a remarkable poetic way of describing the opening and closing of each of those epochs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one thing that I tell people when I have talked to them about this. I said, when you read Genesis, take the way young Earth creationists want to read it and say, just read it prima facie, don't even bring any of this stuff in. It doesn't give you a date. Now, they want to turn around and then claim it does give you a date if you go off of all these genealogies and things along those lines. But the problem with that, well, there's multiple problems with that. But one is, well, depending on which text you use, you wind up with different dates,
right,
which should raise some problems. But the other thing is, it's just so incredibly obvious to me that when you're reading Genesis, the purpose of those genealogies is not to give you dates. It's there to rend like theological and hierarchical authority and things along those lines. It's not there so you can go turn around and try to date the point of creation. It's very, very clear that even if you can do that, it's not what the author intended for there to be. It would be like an accidental thing at best if you could do that.
Isn't it interesting that none of the genealogies after Genesis 5 have the ages given? So in Chronicle, you won't have the age given for Adam. In Luke's genealogy, you won't have the ages given. It's just this was the father, this was the son, this was the father. And then again, you have, obviously, depending on the text. Like, for example, Matthew 1:1. This is the genesis of Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now you've literally skipped so many generations, but you're calling him, as the son of David. So obviously context matters in that sense.
Yeah, and the other thing I've noticed and I tried to get into push when she was on Scarlet on this a little bit, is they tend to kind of say it's like all or nothing. Like either everything about Genesis is completely historical or none of it is. And it doesn't have to be that way. You can tell the truth in somewhat poetic ways. Yeah, I mean, people have written poems about war and things like that. Or here's a easy example: was the movie 300 true? That should be
that movie as well.
Answer, because what that is a highly, highly stylized, in many senses through film, poetic retelling of an event that really, really did happen. But it's obviously filled with all kinds of exaggerations and things that look cool. But the Battle of Thermopylae really did happen. Leonidas, and it wasn't 300, but some Spartans stayed there and died. And so in some sense it's true, but in other senses there's points where you say, no, they're exaggerating. They're making themselves look cooler than they really were for a bunch of various reasons. And not to say that like Genesis is like exaggerating or making itself look cooler than it really is. But it doesn't have to be either or like that. It can be a bit of both. You can have a story told with poetic refrains that is organized in a structural and theological way rather than chronologically and things along those lines.
And to be honest, I love that film. I know.
I do too. It's a great film.
And the ending, there's just so much as an individual, especially as a male. Like the Leonidas persona, I just love Jared Butler's depiction of him, especially at the end where he just cries out, "My queen, my wife, my love." Now, you can extrapolate that in so many different ways, because my queen, my wife, is he talking about the kingdom of, Greece, or obviously he's speaking about his wife because he's thinking of his wife in that moment. So there's all these like matrix of ideas that you can just extract out of that beautiful scene, which is fictional, but it's true in the sense of you can derive truth from it. And I think that's the intention of, and so this is sort of my gripe with Young Earth Creationists. It's just a very wooden reading.
Yes, definitely.
When you take a step back and you realize Genesis 1, like, for example, Psalm 104. Psalm 104 is David's paraphrase of Genesis 1. How do we know it's David? Is because after the Dead Sea Scrolls, we actually have David there in the title. And now, scholars like James Hoffmeyer, the Egyptologist, suddenly noticed connections between the Aten creation hymn of Egypt, the solar worship that was taking place, of sort of monotheistic worship that was taking place, and a lot that you see in the Aten religion, theologically speaking, you see repeated in Psalm 104, and David is then also utilizing Genesis 1 imagery to make a polemical argument that it's Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh all the way through, and repurposing the Aten hymn all over time. So all of these passages have it's this mishmash of application that's required. It has to respond to the ancient Near Eastern context. It has to also appeal to a particular audience, in this case the Israelites, and their meaning as a people in history. Because and in fact, there's a scholar, his name is Seth Postel. He wrote his dissertation on this, titled Adam as Israel, where everything you read about in Genesis 1 to 3 typifies exactly in the same way Israel later on functions. When you have a single individual fall, all of humanity falls. When you have a single king or whoever leading Israel falls, all of Israel falls. Like you see this typology taking place. The Garden of Eden, with the trees and the holy presence and the divine council and so on, the tabernacle fits exactly that same structure. So people like John Walton will say, oh, but then that's interesting, because then the Genesis 1 narrative of the whole cosmos being this temple of God, the ceiling and the lights, and again, it's like the tabernacle is modeled after that. Like, so it has to engage this vast, complex, rich ancient Near Eastern cultural way of thinking, and specifically the psychology of these ancient Israelites, don't forget, coming out of Egypt. And this goes into a whole other tangent on why do the Old Testament laws exist the way they do. And I believe it's because it's God's way of, so he's borrowing the ancient Near Eastern laws, the pagan laws, sort of repurposing them in his own way, sort of watering them down a little bit, to bring about a deprogramming of a primitive way of thinking and evolving them towards a proper ethic, which is the Messianic covenant, which is the laws under Jesus, not the Mosaic law. The laws of good life, not death. And so, it's this. So in my opinion, God is like, so if God is behind all of this, he sort of has to engage all of this and have in mind a future application for this thing called the church that'll come on the scene. And then, on it goes with science and how people will be thinking 2,000 years after that.
Yeah. I really like how you keep turning around and appealing to meaning. And this is probably fresh on my mind because 6 days ago I did a debate with a guy on the nature of inerrancy. And what I've come to start to think, and I'm not absolutely convinced about this, but it's the direction I'm going in, but maybe somebody can still talk me out of it, is I think inerrancy is better thought of as residing in the meaning rather than in the actual physical text. So the way I would say it is, when we look at the Gospels, for example, what's inerrant is the meaning Christ intended when he spoke about the kingdom of God and told parables, the meaning he intended when he gave his Sermon on the Mount, and so on and so forth. Because if you tie it to the physical text, you immediately have all kinds of various problems. Like, for example, when Christ gives his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, Well, it's very, very, very unlikely what we have in Matthew 5 is a word-for-word transcription of what Christ taught, because there's various reasons you would say that, like, when he does the feeding of the 5,000, clearly they were teaching for a lot longer than 10 or 15 minutes, which is about how long it takes you to read the Sermon on the Mount. So why don't we have the full thing? Well, we probably have the bullet points or a summary of Christ's teaching. Like, I imagine he gave each point, told parables and things to illustrate it, and moved on to the next one, and they probably took breaks and things like that, because that's how it happens when people teach for days and days on end, and you can find other parallels. So then what do you turn around and do with that if you want inerrancy to be tied to the physical text? Well, you've got a big problem. But if you turn around and say, oh, no, what's inerrant is not the individual word choices, the very down to the individual grammar and things like that. What's inerrant is the meaning that Christ intended. Then you avoid all those problems. And I still think you could probably find some other problems with tying it to the meaning, because there's no way you can do. Well, I've learned the hard way that anytime you take a position in philosophy or theology, you're always going to run into some problems with it. It's just the way it is. There's no system that some reasonable person can't come up to and go, well, what about this?
More questions arise than answers.
Yeah. But I do think that's probably a better way to do it, and that I find that ties in very well with what you're saying about Genesis. Is what we should be looking at is not like specifically, well, the individual grammar and wording of the text. We should be looking at, well, what was the meaning that the author intended? If I'm understanding you correctly.
But you can do both. You can do, which is what J.L. Saleham has done. You can do a rigid, grammatical, historical commentary, whatever you want, on the text. And critical commentaries are designed to be just that. That's why because of that, that's why we now know that the Bereshit word in the opening verse, just by grammar alone, is not an independent clause; it's a dependent clause. And so, but then application and meaning derives out of that. Like, you can extrapolate so much. In fact, just very briefly, this can lead into another tangent. But when you mentioned the feeding of the 5,000, there is a scholar. His name is David Fidler. He's a legit scholar, Oxford and so on. But he's sort of like he's a Christian, but he's very sympathetic to Gnosticism.
Oh,
because his scholarship is in the Nag Hammadi context, and he was blown away because the whole 5,000 thing, especially to the atheists, like they always sort of poke fun at it, like this is a quote unquote miracle that contradicts the natural laws of nature, blah, 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 blah. But Fidler goes, well, based on my research in the Gnostic context, isn't it interesting that, because the Gnostics was mostly into mathematics, and just a moment ago I mentioned how mathematics was more esoteric than like what we do today. And so he was able to then decipher a mathematical, a geometrical shape of that value. Now, this is not Gamatria, by the way. This is something vastly different. So Gamatria is sort of, it's a bit random. It's a bit arbitrary in like 666, and they try and connect it to Nero and Hitler and all that stuff.
I've heard of that, yeah.
But or even like the Bible code thing, like that's all nonsensical. Mm-hmm. This is like legit. So in fact, Fidler is doing what Saleham is doing with Genesis 1. He's like, we know that Matthew and Mark record this feeding, and they give this figure 5,000, and then it's very specific. There's the 12 baskets, and so many fish, and there's so many loaves, and when you do the analysis at the end of the day, especially with the Greek words, guess what? Just that description, if you were to give it a geometrical shape. Now, this may sound really foreign to you guys, but the simplest way I can explain this in a modern way is the Cartesian plane. So you have the XY axis, which are basically the dimensions, length and width. And so if you want to take an algebraic formulation, like say y equals x, something very basic, well, mathematically, that's an algebraic expression to say that y, whatever y is, x will be that. But then you have those philosophers, hence Descartes, the Cartesian plane named after him. What shape does this equation take? Oh, okay. On the y-axis plane, it's, if y is 0, x is 0. If y is 1, x is 1. And then you draw the line going at a certain gradient in that direction.
Yeah.
And now it has a shape. Now you've defined a shape for that equation. So is there a shape to this 5,000 figure that we see in the story? And guess what shape it brings up? It brings up a basket with the fish and the loaves, and it's just this remarkable, perfectly geometrical shape that takes place. And here's his point. Because he's a Gnostic scholar, if this text, and obviously you have proto-Gnostics arising on the scene in the first century, if this text is meant to also communicate to a certain particular group of people, which would be the Gnostics, don't forget that the text is speaking to the Jews as well as the Greco-Roman audience, but what about this Gnostic sect going on? Why does the story exist the way it does? Because they will be doing this type of thing. So they won't even care about reading Matthew the way you and I would read Matthew. They'd just be going into their little tangent in their own way of thinking, because that's the way they're brought up to think. And so Matthew and that's the question, is it Matthew that did this? Was it someone else that did this? But again, through what we believe in the providence of God, it's there in the text, it's like if a Gnostic guy were to, oh, this is interesting, and I'm going to do a little deciphering here, and then he discovers that this is the argumentation, and so what's the point? What's the message? Jesus, the Logos, is the one who did this. He's the one you should be worshiping, not this Gnostic religion that you're believing in. Like, that's the amazing thing that he discovered, and hence the meaning. When you're talking about meaning, there's a meaning being derived from the text. So I just wanted to throw that in. So David Fiedler is the guy who did this, and the book he wrote was called Jesus, the Son of God, but it's S-U-N.
Oh,
and so, yeah.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Okay. Well, we've been talking like an hour and a half, and we haven't even got to the flood yet. So
all right, go.
I guess we should probably get into that, since that was pretty much the whole what I wanted to focus on. Not that any of this has been bad, quite the opposite. So, so let's see here. I know when we were talking, you linked me to one of the videos you have on your channel where you were talking about like why you would think Noah's flood was a regional flood rather than a global one. And I know you summarized that at the beginning of our talk here, but is there more involved with the general idea of Noah's flood being a regional one than what you described, that it was roughly 13,000 years ago in and around what's now the Persian Gulf, and I assume like Iran and Kuwait and Iraq?
It's more in the Persian Gulf per se. It's all underwater now. So Jeffrey Rose was the guy I interviewed on this channel. Well, do you want me to be a little bit more specific about my model?
Yeah, why don't you just go into what are the evidences for this, like geological, archaeological, and then we could talk about what the biblical text does and doesn't say. But I think to lay the groundwork, like you're more familiar with this than I am, but I would assume that, like, if you talk to your average geologist or archaeologist who's familiar with this, they're probably going to say, "Oh yeah, there was a flood at the Persian Gulf." There's no doubt about that. So is that more or less true, and what's the evidence of that?
Yeah. So I've been researching this, and this is the thing. This is when I was speaking about earlier on about studies, how providentially it's like a waiting game. You just be patient, and whoop, there comes a study, and bam, it goes right in line with what you need. So in 2014 was when I started to look into the flood context, because so 2013 was when I started to get familiar with, say, someone like Hugh Ross and his work. And so he released the book Navigating Genesis in 2014, and so Jeffrey Rose is in 2010 when Jeffrey Rose published that work about this Persian Gulf oasis. So yeah, I'm going all over the place here. So basically, you have a general consensus for the last 50 years obviously accumulation of data over time about human anthropology. The general consensus is from Africa, you have the emergence of the Homo sapien, that then, so 200,000 years ago, that then they migrate into the Arabian Peninsula, and from there you have this forking out into all the various cultures from, say, 60,000 years onwards.
Mm-hmm.
The other questions asked at the time were things like, we noticed that in these migration patterns, we noticed bottlenecking taking place. In fact, in Biologos, Dennis Venema, who wrote Adam and a Genome with Scott McKnight, he actually brings this up, that the smallest, I mean, we're talking genetics here now, like the smallest conceivable amount of humans that you can have, so the smallest population you can have without the human race going extinct is roughly about 10,000 individuals. And interestingly enough, humanity came at that very, very scary lower limit around 60-something thousand years ago.
I've heard of that. The documentaries I've heard have described that to an eruption of a supervolcano that put the world into like nuclear winter. Yeah, right. Yeah. I've heard of that several times before. Mm-hmm.
And now, Hugh Ross, like 2 months ago, in fact, it was news a couple of months ago, they found that there's another extinction, well, a near extinction event of a meteorite that actually hit, I think somewhere in the lower Indian Ocean area, like 15,000 years ago, which is very recent. And it's part of the discussion of, the climate change going on at the moment. So, what fascinated me as I'm reading Hugh Ross's because he's sort of doing the groundwork, because he's pulling in all the data. He's pulling in all this stuff up until 2014. He's pulling in all the data. And anthropologists like Jeffrey Rose has established that when you have this bottlenecking taking place, well, it's interesting that they're just bottlenecked in this oasis location, which didn't have any water, which is the Persian Gulf region, and they just stayed there. And then Jeffrey Rose will sort of go into tangents and go into the sort of like, it's sort of conjectural, but the neuroscientific, psychological aspects of these early humans due to the size of the skulls and so on. And this is another interesting fine-tuning argument, and that is our brains are the biggest that the laws of nature can allow without any larger cook itself. Like, so there's all of that going on in anthropological research. And so when Jeffrey Rose analyzed the tools, he was noticing some quite a remarkable sophistication taking place for these early humans, which, again, from a concordance perspective, the whole taxonomy taking place with Adam naming the animals and his tools to maintain the garden, and like, it's just interesting that there's sophistication taking place very early on in Genesis. And Genesis 4, you're already having a description of other humans that Cain was afraid of, that over time he goes and meets multiple women. The very first instance of polygamy is actually with Cain. He goes and fortifies a city, and then you have his well, it depends on how you interpret Genesis 6, but you have like his genealogical lineage warring with the other genealogical lineage, and then the flood takes place. I don't really take that view. I believe that something more supernatural is going on with the Nephilim context. Because if I see the incarnation as a supernatural sort of interaction between the divine and the human, then why not a lesser form of that, but between, say, the angelic realm and women? So I personally don't have a problem with that. But
yeah, that's a fascinating thing in and of itself. It's hard to know what to make of it. So.
I mean, I believe that leads to a genetic deformity, which is giantism, which then leads into other deformities like having 6 fingers on each hand, and also blurred vision and a tumor on the head. That's why David flung a stone in Goliath's forehead, because giantism has you generate big tumors here. And
interesting. Okay,
right. There's a lot of interesting facts, and there's, believe it or not, there's peer-reviewed medical papers describing this stuff, and then appealing to the Bible, like in medical journal text. Like they actually go, "Oh, but isn't it interesting? Goliath was slumbering forward, seeing blurred visions." And anyway, but so Genesis 1 is this chronology of natural history of Earth. Mm-hmm. By the time you reach humanity, it's just a very generic way of saying multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule it. Now, the subdue, rule stuff is actually all negative. Like if you do a word study on all those words in the Old Testament, it's pretty harsh.
Yeah, I was listening to somebody do that just, I think, yesterday, and he was saying all the other times it's like military conquest or something, or like literally trampling somebody under your foot or something else like that. That's very, very negative and harsh.
Right. So that automatically, just off the bat, rules out the young of creationist context of, no death before the fall, when clearly, if it's a perfect creation, why is the very harsh terminologies used, given to humanity to do, like it's a blessing for them to do this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So you have that happening. Then it's very interesting that Genesis 2, from verse 5 onwards, grammatically, and this is what John Bolton will argue, it's a continuation of Genesis 1. It's not another repeat of Genesis 1. It's a continuation where suddenly the scene shifts to a whole other location that has no rain, and yet it describes an underground stream arising. Mm-hmm. Oh, but isn't that interesting? The only way an underground stream would arise is if you have an aquifer underneath. Sure enough, the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula has underground streams rising from underneath. And there's no rain in that region, especially at the time of the late Pleistocene era, leading up to the Holocene.
Yeah, rain is very rare there even now. I was over there when I was in the Army back in Iraq, the Second Iraq War, in 2003, 2004. And when we first got there, there was a terrible rainstorm for 2 days. And and then the water just stayed there for months, a month or two afterwards, because there was
plain.
There was nowhere for it to go. So there were roads blocked off and things for a month. But then the whole rest of the time we were there, the whole another year, didn't rain once. At least not that I was aware of in any way. Maybe it sprinkled one time in the middle of the night when I was asleep and I didn't notice, but sure didn't seem like it rained even once the whole rest of the time we were there. So
Right. So Genesis 1, just generically humanity, just multiply, fill the earth. Okay, so just if we just say if our entire Bible was just Genesis 1, what would we conclude? God did all this, humanity comes on the scene, and they're multiplying. That's it. You can't say that humanity wasn't multiplying, filling the earth, subduing the earth. This is a potential of that to happen only after the fall. You can't say that. No, in Genesis 1, that's what the text is saying. In Genesis 2, then, is a continuation where suddenly the scene shifts to a location where there's no humanity. But it starts to give very specific geographical details. It speaks about the geography of, say, where the Hijaz Mountains are. So that you have the Pishon River flowing where there's gold, then the Gihon River flowing in this other direction. Then you have notice Euphrates and Tigris is very specific. We know where those are located in the Persian Gulf region. And I find it interesting that we in the 90s, the satellite imagery was from space shuttle imagery was done in this region where we suddenly noticed this dry riverbed that flowed down from the Hijaz Mountains down into that Persian Gulf sort of head. And so this geologist was like, oh, this is interesting. And they went and investigated that and then found out that it dried out about 9,000 to 10,000 years BC. Obviously, and so this is known as the Wadi al-Batin River. So then archaeologists and paleontologists like Jeffrey Rose, obviously doing work in that region, noticed that, early humanity, well before 10,000 years, we're talking in the 50,000 year range, they were located there, and that was flowing. Because don't forget, those mountains are fully ice capped and water's coming down those mountains. And so Jeffrey Rose's point is that, okay, you have Euphrates, Tigris. Now this is the Pishon, and the Gihon is coming from the Armenian range, and they're coming and meeting at a head. So this is spooking him out a little bit, especially in my interview with him. I asked him, were you sort of, because he read the Bible sparingly, but were you sort of like, back in your early childhood, were you sort of like remembering that this is the text script? Because he's a Jew. Yeah? So he's like, yeah, I was remembering the text as I'm doing the research, that there seems to be this correlation. A quick note on textual criticism here. So the JDP hypothesis that says that the Yahwist narrative was written in the 600s BC. So Genesis 2 is, according to this theory, is written in 600 BC. So if this riverbed dried out easily 9 or 8, let's say 8,000 years prior to the Yahwist writing this, how did the Yahwist know it existed? You see, there's this memory that somehow has survived if you're going to hold to that theory. And it's a remarkably accurate memory.
Yeah, I said something similar one time when I was giving a class at a church on how to, well, it was basically on scripture, and how one of the aspects was how to read and understand. I gave about 7 principles and said, now let's do something dangerous and apply this to the first chapter of Genesis. And I said, well, Christian tradition says that Moses was the author of it. And I know some academic scholarships doubt that. And I'm not terribly familiar with that, but okay, let's say there may be reason for that, but just grant for the sake of argument that Moses did write it. Well, how did he know about Genesis? Well, there's only 2 possibilities. He was repeating a tradition that he'd received through his culture and from various other sources, or literally God came and told him exactly what to write, like essentially beamed it into his mind. And unless you take like a dictation theory of inspiration, where that's how all of Scripture was taken, the most obvious explanation is Moses was writing a tradition he received from his culture and other sources that predated him, probably by hundreds, if not thousands of years, and he was just copying it down as God foreordained that he would to give us Genesis. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying on that, yeah. So yeah, you had this. You had the 4 rivers mentioned. Then you have the emergence of Adam and Eve, which I believe Eve already existed at the time. So that whole rib thing is nothing but an ancient Near Eastern picture. So it's not a rib, actually; it's a side. It's a side of Adam, and literally, it's Adam being cut in 2. And it's not man and beast that are compatible; it's man and woman. Again, that beautiful imagery of in the Hebrew wordplay there, that ontologically are mates and they're one flesh. And so I find it curious that Adam has a vision, because in the Hebrew tardima, or the Greek word ekstasis, where we get ecstasy from, all the patristics were saying Adam had this like this vision, kind of like you see Abraham, and Abraham has a deep sleep, and then you have in his deep sleep God is walking with a candle in between the carcasses of that sacrifice, or when Peter has a deep sleep and then a sheet comes down in Acts 10. This is a vision. So you had that description taking place, and so the point of Genesis 2 then, I find interesting in this sense, is God then starts to localize himself in human history at a particular location that is given very specific geographical details, and Adam and Eve are now the high priests, so to speak, of this larger humanity that's in that region now.
That's the the functionalist view that John Walton espouses to some degree.
So notice I'm taking concordism, ancient Near Eastern stuff. I'm trying to synthesize all this because I think there's truth in all of these models.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, I'm coming now from a scientific, so the Book of Nature context, and saying, what does human anthropology say? And yes, there was a bottlenecking of humanity in this location at this particular time when the four rivers were flowing exactly the way the text says. And so then the next thing to do is to then understand the flood. So what is this flood thing going on?
Mm-hmm.
So again, I find it interesting that the flora and so not so much the flora is described except for the olive leaf, which again is just more north of the Armenian range, which is where by the way, Urartu is the location, or to be more specific, Mount Judy is the mountain region where the ark lands. It's not, because Ararat is it's actually a late word that appears late. It's not what originally was Urartu in that region, but meaning it's so you have the Persian Gulf, and I don't know how many kilometers up, but it's quite close. Just to, like if you go on Google Maps, if you take the length of the Persian Gulf distance and you do maybe half of that length and go up north a bit more, that's where the ark lands. And I showed this on my research slides and so on.
So it's definitely not on Mount Ararat in Turkey, is what you're saying.
No, it's much lower down.
Yeah, this theory would obviously entail that if there is something on Mount Ararat in Turkey, it's not Noah's Ark. So
no, yeah. So in my research, what I wanted to do is, okay, I find it interesting that everything seems to be localized here, especially in the flood story. So, okay, I'm going to put a halt on the text. Let's go to the science. Is there any form of research done in regards to the topography of this region? And that if it's feasible, like kind of like what you just mentioned a moment ago, when it rained heavy and then the water just stayed, stagnant.
Yep.
Does the topography actually work if there was hypothetically this flooding that happens? And at the time when I was doing this, I didn't know about this Persian Gulf flooding. I just was thinking somehow water was just dumped in that region. And I came across research on what's called the Zanclean flood, which happened 5 million years prior, where you have the whole Mediterranean just evaporated.
I think I've heard of that.
Was salt deposits. And way on the far west, the Gibraltar Strait gave way, and then you had the Atlantic Ocean just spilling in, and then the flow of water flowing through. And the amazing thing is, when it finally reached the Middle Eastern region, it was like a tsunami effect that spilled over into the Persian Gulf region, and the direction of flow happened to be in the same direction where you see our modern-day Persian Gulf region. And so that gave me a clue that topographically speaking, that region is very low-lying compared to the Armenian range of the north and the Hejaz Mountains range down at the south. So in between these two ranges, you have a very low-lying region, and it's very flat for water to flow the way it does all the way back in the Zanclean era.
Yeah.
So
because water will always go to the lowest point if it can.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So then I was like, okay. So that was another clue. So then I was thinking, okay, what pushed humanity out of this region in the human anthropological research papers? And all studies, we're talking for the last 50 plus years, all of them say it was a slow, gradual migration away because of the slow rising level of the Indian Ocean spilling into what we now know as the Persian Gulf. Mm-hmm. And that, at the time of so everything was fitting in beautifully, but the text says that this is a remarkably rapid flooding.
Yeah.
That took place. Mm-hmm. Well, it does mention, like it was roughly 150 days worth of rain and water, right? The fountains of the deep coming up like this, and then the water from the heavens. So
yeah, it lasted a while, but it started abruptly. Is the way
there was
text seems to read.
It was like a while, but at the same time, a lot at the same time. So the one thing that really caused me problems from a concordance perspective was the science is saying it's very gradual, and so gradual. In fact, it's thousands of years in the making. It's not 1 year. So then I was thinking, oh gosh, well, I'll just have to maybe the Black Sea deluge is true then, if you've heard of the Black Sea deluge, because
I've heard a little bit about that, yeah.
Because scientists are saying it's most likely that, because that was certain. Then a 2015 paper came out. Now, this is a year after Hugh Ross published his Navigating Genesis book, by an Arab geophysicist. Geomorphological changes in the Persian Gulf region during the Holocene, roughly 13,000 years ago, and he was asking the same question I was asking, and that is, humanity. Yeah, prior papers were talking about humanity's dispersion, in this gradual sense. But recent papers like Jeffrey Rowe's and so on are showing that humanity it's like as if they were running from something, actually. They're dispersing a lot faster than what the papers in the 90s were saying. And then he found evidence that it wasn't thousands of years in the making, it was within a year that you have a giving away of a natural dam where the Indian Ocean then spills in and then forms what we now know as the Persian Gulf. In fact, it spread so much that it actually overspilled quite a bit, went up quite a ways, and it wasn't just the spilling that was happening, but because don't forget, why is it happening? Because the rising sea levels. We're talking, especially with the climate change discussion happening at the moment. This is evidence of global warming happening at the time.
Yeah, this is at the end of the last ice age, when some glaciers were melting and retreating, so sea levels were rising, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I noticed the text is describing the windows of the heavens, coming down and so on. And in the ancient Near East, this is very poetic language, because in the ancient Near East, mountains would hold up the solid dome of the sky. Mm-hmm. Now, mountains, especially the peaks of mountains, was known as the abode of the gods, and in fact, sometimes the peaks of mountains was described as the heavens itself. Now, if water's coming from the sky, isn't it interesting that the mountainous regions in that area, water is flowing down those mountains, and sure enough, this is what the science is saying, that the Hijaz Mountains, a lot of water would come down, the Armenian Mountains, a lot of water would come down, and you have the Indian Ocean spilling in. And now it makes remarkable sense that, yes, in that region, no one could have survived that, because you're talking at a minimum 700,000 square kilometers worth of water just filling up that region. Now, here's a last thing in regards to the flood. Noah's Ark is not Ken Ham's Ark.
That doesn't surprise me very much.
I was blown away. John Walton, in his Lost World of Noah's Flood, he points out that recent Akkadian scholarship, so scholarship in the Akkadian language, verse 14 of chapter 6 describes the ark with cedar. No, sorry, not cedar. Cedar is the translation. Gopher wood.
Gopher wood, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, gopher is plague scholars. They're like, what is gopher? Oh, it could be cypress. It could be cedar. So it's conjectural. But a study was done with Akkadian loanwords, and they connected it to a particular Akkadian word that means reed. And now Jeffrey Rowe's, again, so all the anthropologists on the scene are saying, well, we have what's called the marsh Arabs. And even today, they're still doing exactly what humans were doing 10,000 years ago. And that is, if the whole region is flooded, the only way to survive is to take the reeds that they use to build their houses with, reshape it into this reed hut-looking house ark thing, put farm animals on board, and survive.
And ride out the flood, basically.
Yeah, and they're known as the Marsh Arabs.
Huh,
so
fascinating.
So, and if you translate gopher to be reed, and there's a whole translation in John Walton's book, that make yourself an ark out of reeds from the huts that you have and so on. And then you have Moses' ark. So when Moses was in his little basket, that's made out of reeds. It's the same ark wording used. And then he has Second Temple literature like the Wisdom of Solomon describing Noah's ark as made out of cheap pieces of wood. And another word, it's nothing but a raft. So even in Second Temple literature, you have the depictions of the ark as being this insignificant thing, that the most significant thing happened, and that is the survivability of Noah, which was the messianic figure to come. And that same type of language you see with Moses. Insignificant thing, surviving the most significant thing, which is Moses.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a recurring theme.
Exactly.
All over the scripture is that God takes what we would term as insignificant, inconsequential, unimportant, and even stupid, and uses it for these great, amazing, big things. That's a theme all over everywhere.
Right. And that fits with the fauna of the region, because the farm animals, but the animals Noah takes on board, interestingly, if you do a very careful study on the 7 that go on board and the 2 that go on board, the clean and the unclean, there's no emperor penguins going on board, there's no dinosaurs going on board, there's no kangaroos, and they're farm animals. And now this is a bit of a stretch on my part, but it is a conjecture on my part, but when you look at Job, the book of Job, especially from chapter 38 onwards, it's actually mostly a creation account. You have God giving Job lessons from animals, and he gives 10 specific animals as a means of teaching Job. Now this goes into a tangent on Job scholarship and where's Job located, where's Uz, for example, and so on. In my opinion, I think Gleason Archer has the best argumentation that Job is, and how ironic, Job is located in that Arabian Peninsula region. And if those animals are native to Job, and especially what's described in the book of Job, those fit remarkably well with the type of Hebrew terms you see in the Genesis story, with the type of animals that have gone on board. And those animals would have fit on this, what's known as a Mudheef house, the Marsh Arab type style ark. So
it wouldn't, you said it wouldn't be 2 of every existing creature in the world. It would be 2 of what are the farm and domesticated animals that they had and used around here at that particular time. And probably wouldn't even have been then all the animals in that region, because we can assume there would be wild animals that aren't domesticated that would have been of no use to the people. In fact, some of them probably would have been pests they would have liked to get rid of. So,
yeah, and you have Josephus saying that humanity actually, there were people that survived the flood. Like, he actually quotes from legends, Babylonian legends, and he has no problem. He doesn't refute it. He has no problem with it.
So that's the end of the second part of Rob and I's discussion. We went on for about another hour. Next week, I'll play the third part of that, and I'll level some objections to this theory that the flood was a regional one, as well as some objections to the concordance model of Genesis that he subscribes to, and he'll get a chance to respond to that. In the meantime, write in and let me know what you think of this idea that Noah's flood was a regional flood. I do find the evidence for this theory fairly compelling. It seems to me there's definitely something to this when you look at the geological and archaeological evidence and how it all just more or less fits up right in that same time frame, that there was a really big flood there and that humanity seemed to be, as Rob was saying, bottlenecked there at the same time. I find that pretty compelling myself, but write in, let me know what you think. You can always reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or check out the Facebook page I've started for the podcast. Just type in The Examined Life with Phil, you'll find it. And as always, if you like what I'm doing here on the podcast, share it on your social media, get the word out to more people. So thanks again for listening, and I'll be back again next week with the third part of Rob and I's discussion on Noah's flood.
Hi, everyone. Dr. John Aquaviva here, author, professor of exercise science, and host of Faith in Sport on WCAT Radio. Please join us as we discuss current events in the sports world, bring on inspiring guests, and discuss how our Catholic faith impacts all who are involved in sport, the athletes, the coaches, the referees, and yes, even the fans. So join me, Dr. John Aquaviva, as I discuss my two favorite topics, my faith and the world of sport, on the Faith in Sports show here on WCAT Radio.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.